Oh, they're all here. Oh, great.
Oh, all the humans arriving.
Nice. Hi, Alistair.
No.
Hey. Welcome, everyone. Hey, Paddy. Bilal, yes.
Do I have any friends?
Alistair. I know Alistair. That's
yes,
good.
so
Hey, how you doing?
Hi.
Hi, welcome, everyone. If you want to turn on your videos, if you can, if you've got like, if you're out in the sticks like me and turning on a video is like a slightly dodgy idea, you can turn it on. Great. Yes.
Faces, human faces.
Great. So while we're waiting for people, I'm just thinking, if you can click on participants, if everyone can click on participants, and they will see their name, and they will see many other names. If you can just hover over your name and rename yourself your name. Some people are iPad 3, for example, which I don't believe is your name.
Hey, but
and
no
also
shame. Let's not put any shame on people if they are born iPad 3.
If you can add in alongside your name your mood when you think about the world that is coming after coronavirus, which could be hope or despair or I don't know.
Is indigestion a mood, Ronan?
Yes, indigestion is a mood. Nausea could be a mood as well. You can put in nausea. But let's just get a sense of, get a feel for the room and how people are feeling about this world that is being created. I have to change my own. Rich is disorientated. Zoe has hope and despair in equal measure. Trevor is uncertain and optimistic. Great. Cautiously optimistic, cautiously optimistic.
I think cautious optimism might be a uniquely British mood. I'm just guessing. I don't know any of these people.
So what I've found is that when you join a Zoom call and can you switch? I think if everyone can switch to gallery view, so you can see all of these faces on the screen. And yeah, when you join a big Zoom call, you're like, who are all these people? I feel slightly alienated and uncomfortable. So it's often just good to have like some kind of like collective introduction. So if everyone can turn their mics off and just be like, hi, hello, welcome, and just everyone do it at the same time, and there'll just be a kind of a cacophony of noise.
Hello, hi, yes, hi.
Hi.
Welcome. Oh, yes.
Can we get the waving
yes,
in?
Hi. Yes. Wonderful. Yes.
Hi.
Humans that I know.
Yes. Well done. We're all here to learn.
Wow.
Great. Cool. Great. I think we can start.
Shall I mute everyone else, Ronan, now that we've unlocked that can of worms,
Yes.
giving people the power?
Yeah.
I mean, what?
Okay. Dark optimism.
I muted you.
You motherfucker. Right. So I am Ronan, and you are Rich. So thank you for coming tonight. So basically we've got 90 minutes and this is an interactive talk. So, and it's about the light and the dark of the coronavirus. So part of this is us giving a talk or giving our sense of whether on balance there's cause for optimism or pessimism and doing that kind of like forecasting. But we're also, both of us personally, and I'm sure many of you, very tired of this kind of guru syndrome where you've got talking heads who are like delivering the sermon or the truth about our system and how it's going to change. And rather we want to embrace this shift towards collective intelligence. And so this is an experiment in how does a group of people actually come together and make sense and pool its intelligence. Because everyone here probably could give a version of a talk like this, or could definitely keep people enthralled in a pub for an hour if one was open, about where the world is going. And so we're really, what we'd like to do in terms of a format for tonight is, do a bit of like a download about what we're seeing, but also offer some kind of conceptual tools, so ways of looking at the pandemic in a systemic way or in a more complex way, and then to hand it over to everyone, and for us to go into breakout rooms and have a more intimate discussion about what you're seeing, and then for us to take that back and kind of try and weave it into something coherent. So that's the format for tonight. I think it's worth just introducing Rich and I. So both of us have been working in the systems change space for about 10 years. And I think what's interesting for us is that so much of the change that we've been desperately trying to bring about and struggling to bring about has happened in the space of weeks, or the potential of it has happened in the space of weeks, which makes us feel quite redundant. And so we've been seeing coronavirus as like the ultimate change maker, its ability to accelerate trends of all kinds, whether they're positive or negative. And I think that being in that kind of culture change, systems change community that I'm sure many of us are in, there's like a lot of cause for optimism. And yet I think that something that I'm noticing is that it can prevent us from fully apprehending the ways in which very negative tendencies and trends in the world are also amplified or given new opportunity. And so we're interested in how we can really bring all of that into the room and hold the complexity of that, and not kind of come down on one side prematurely. So Rich, do you want to say anything by way of introduction?
Sure. What can I add? Yes, and when you say we've been in the social change space, in my case, that's like a background in activism, being involved on the streets, trying to do grassroots change that way. And then I moved into technology. I thought if I can make the perfect communication tool, then we'll solve all of our communication problems. And then since then, I've gotten more into the heart of the matter, which I think is about culture and about relationships and how do groups work, and how do we make sense and make decisions, and how does governance work, and that sort of stuff. And I put in my name disoriented, because one of the aspects of this experience for me has been not just the rupture with the interruption to the normal, that things felt more or less stuck in a certain way with these slight tendencies one way or the other, and now suddenly it seems like we've accelerated or jumped or spun around 360 degrees. But also my sense of who should I listen to, which sources of news make sense, who's giving me guidance and orientation, and who can help me orient. That has really been disrupted as well. I'm really confused about who to listen to, and so in that moment of confusion, my instinct is to find some people like you who are available and interested to plug your brains into my brains for a minute and just see what sits in the space between us that might be a bit more sensible. Because as I pay attention to what's happening in the news from different countries, all I see is this infinitely expanding possibilities, and some of them are positive and some of them are negative, and it's really hard to orient and know which ones are likely, or which ones I should be involved with, or which ones I should be paying attention to or avoiding. So my hope is that we can just have a small taste of being a collective intelligence and do some filtering and thinking together.
Thanks, Rich. I'm also going to invite a little bit more slowness. So often again, in these more intellectual spaces, it's very easy just to kind of run away in the abstract and in thinking. And I think, one of the reasons that, this is hosted by the Psychedelic Society, that's an opportunity to really be fully embodied in our thinking. And so, and to slow down, and to, there's a lot of talk about this idea of sovereignty, not being swayed by what your in-group thinks, what is said in the news, but really discerning, okay, is this true for me? And often, you know, the best indicator of that is just your felt sense. And so I'd just maybe just invite us just to take 30 seconds, 40 seconds together, just to ground in whatever way is good for us. We can sit in our chair or whatever is comfortable, and we'll just take some breaths together and just land into this evening and, you know, leave behind our days.
Ronan, as you invited me into a moment of mindfulness and presence, I suddenly realized that all these pixels on the screen are humans. They're real people in those boxes. So I just, I feel like I'm actually present now and realizing that there are other human beings out there that are not just avatars, but whole complex people. And I'm very grateful for you showing up and joining us on this journey.
Yeah, me too. So yeah, I think we'll kick off with some context. So before the pandemic, I was working with Extinction Rebellion. I was in the UK, I was one of their political strategists. And it was the October Rebellion. It was 6 months after this kind of big explosion of climate emergency going on the political agenda. And Extinction Rebellion were really in the ascendancy. And there was this question around how do we take the public on a journey from awareness of climate emergency, a kind of a sense that the system that we're in is broken, to something that is deeply embodied, that they actually feel the vulnerability of living in a fragile system, and that they also access something deeper within them that would make them want to make a sacrifice in terms of their lifestyle, in terms of the choices they make, who they vote for, how they spend their money, that might affect change. And that was kind of our task in thinking about the October Rebellion, was how do we take people on this deeper journey? And our only frame of reference really was our own lived experience, that actually a common denominator for many people that join Extinction Rebellion is that they've often had what you might describe as a developmental journey. They've had quite deeper experiences that have maybe connected them with some fundamental questions about life. They might have had some adversity, or they might have had an awakening of some kind about the world or something in their inner life. But either way, it was a shift that led to a reorientation. And there was a fundamental challenge, because even if there was a capacity to occupy the streets for 2 weeks and get climate emergency on the agenda and dominate the news coverage, like at the end of the October Rebellion, we generated the advertising equivalent of £1 billion in media coverage. And of course, some of that was visceral and emotional, but you know, it still exists largely on a head level, and people are largely in their 9-to-5 jobs with their 9-to-5 commitments. And we were always asking this question: how do we communicate the near-term vulnerability? How do we show people that this isn't about CO2 in the atmosphere? This is about your children, the people that you love. It's about the supermarket shelves being empty. And it's also about a calling within that to step into a greater version of yourself. And the honest answer is that we didn't really pull it off. to do that, you would have to scale a huge movement that would kind of bring everyone into the fold and give them that transformative experience that can happen when you join a movement. But the scaling wasn't really possible. And it wasn't even within our conception that it would take something like a pandemic to actually create it. Created in the sense of actually bringing the vulnerability and the fragility of our systems to a head and actually showing just how exposed we are to shocks, but also taking us out of our context, the context that just reinforces a certain behavior, and then introducing a whole new set of behaviors that emphasize solidarity and collectivism. And for that to come along with a complete abandoning of the economic and political doctrine up until now is just a hugely exciting space to be in. And I think that combination, I think, speaks to, even though there's a lot of suffering happening at the moment, I think for maybe a lot of people in these circles, there's also a sense of relief, like Rich said at the beginning, that it couldn't go on in this stuck inertia way. You know, the center was quite solid, even though it was very apparent that the system was failing. And so there was a relief there, and there was a sense that something had to shift. And then I think in more recent, maybe in the weeks that followed that initial moment of the pandemic becoming real, there was a reminder that there are still lots of very malicious forces in the world. There are a lot of bad trajectories, and they're also being amplified. So, you know, on the same week that Spain announced universal basic income, we had Viktor Orban in Hungary basically using it to do another huge grasp for power. And so we're seeing that, like it's almost the perennial human story that there are the better angels of our nature and there are demons, and both are amplified in this moment. And that, I think, underscores the importance for people who are really engaged to really fully understand and comprehend the situation that they're in, so that ultimately we can influence it. And I think we can only influence it if we know the full picture. I really like this idea, you know, they talk about the Overton window, this idea that there's always this this kind of spectrum of acceptable and non-acceptable ideas. And what's happened now, people are calling it's like the Overton greenhouse. Things that were considered crazy and radical and decades in the making are now front and center. And it feels like anything is possible. And again, it's both ways. You know, anything is possible in terms of the state can get permission to track your phone and monitor your movements in liberal society, as it is, you know, a complete rethinking of supply chains. And so, you know, so thinking about it from the Overton window to the Overton greenhouse is a way of just actually conceptualizing the possibility space that we're in right now. Which I'm curious to know, because you are on lockdown. I think are you week 5 of lockdown in Italy? And
6.
You were someone that was 6 of lockdown in Italy, and you were very much on the front lines trying to talk about the trends that you were seeing, trying to warn the rest of Europe on Twitter about, you know, exponential curves. But I'm curious if you've anything to say, just by way of orientation and context, about this moment that we're in.
Well, that exponential curve, that was what I had in mind before you called on me. So I'm in Italy with my partner, Nati, and that's the extent of my social network locally. I'm a migrant who's recently arrived here, and so I'm not embedded in a sense of a local community. And so all of my connection to the world happens through these screens. It's a very digital way of being in the world, and you know that's weird at the best of times, let alone during a national disaster. But one of the byproducts of being super online is that I'm really plugged into the zeitgeist, you know, the different stories that are coming through. And when the outbreak first happened in the north of Italy, I got an email from my dad in New Zealand. I'm from New Zealand. That's why my English is weird. And he said, Rich, I want you to really seriously consider whether this is the time for you to, this is in January. I want you to seriously consider if this is the time for you to put down all your work and put down your commitments and come back to New Zealand. And I gave it about 20 seconds of thought and just went, this is not a big deal. And then with less than 3 weeks, was sort of, I think it was about 17 days or something from the outbreak being detected in Italy to the hospitals being overloaded in Milan. And it just hit us like a freight train, so they locked down the northern part of Italy and did what we would call in New Zealand a cock up, meaning they announced the quarantine before they enforced it. And so some tens of thousands of people left the region before the lockdown was enforced. And so then 2 days later, they locked down the whole country. And I was paying attention through that whole time, through that sort of 20-something day process. And even talking with my partner about, yes, this is definitely a pandemic. It's going to be everywhere. It's going to be a big deal. We were sort of saying these things, but really not believing them, really not feeling them in any sense. And it was only after there was that near instantaneous lockdown and sense of disaster, the sense of, the thing that really got me was it's obvious now in retrospect, but I didn't click that it's not just about people getting sick from this virus. It's about overloading the hospital capacity. And therefore, the first cascade impact of that is anyone who needs the emergency services is going to be out of luck. So, people missing out on treatment for having a stroke or could be anything. That really shook me. And of course, Italy was the first European experience of the pandemic. And so I was maybe 2 weeks ahead of some of the northern and western parts of Europe, and sitting in that seat of like, I know what's coming. I've seen it. I felt it. You're not going to anticipate how intense it is. And I spent the entire period just in a state of desperation, trying to, doing that Cassandra thing, trying to go, hey, this is really important. You need to pay attention. I don't want to panic. I don't want to freak you out. But honestly, there's no way you're going to give this enough. You're not paying the right amount of attention to how big this thing is. And I guess that was the first lesson for me was like, well, I'm an engineer. I'm a software developer. I'm good at spreadsheets and mathematics. You think I'd understand exponentials, but I didn't. I really didn't, and not in a felt sense. I just thought exponential meant kind of fast or big or something. But no, exponential is imperceptibly gradual first, and then suddenly overwhelming. And when I look at what's happening in the world in a larger perspective, exponential change is one of the key drivers that we have to be paying attention to at the moment, whether that's about how we have tipping points in the climate system where it's not just that the temperature of the earth is gradually increasing, but as it increases the rate of increase. So we're doing that with climate, and we're doing it with our technological capabilities. I just saw a tweet a moment ago. Someone submitted an essay that was written by a bot and passed. So this is a school kid who's like used some kind of AI to pass his essay, and it's like, that's not a very big deal. We're at on that artificial intelligence piece. We're at that very first piece of the gradual part before it gets suddenly overwhelming. We're in the imperceptibly gradual part, and there's a lot of these exponentials coming our way. And the puzzle that I'm sitting with is, if you can see what's coming, and other people haven't seen it yet, how do you orient to that? What's a useful posture to take? How do you not incite panic or try and tell people that you know better than them, or try and override their intelligence? But I'm looking for a way to act that's not just desperate yelling.
Yeah, so for me, something that I drove from that and something that we've talked about before is that um, this moment has made lots of abstract concepts that are important for humanity to get experiential and embodied for people. Exponential change is one example, but interdependency is something that like we kind of talk about vaguely, and yet when you're in a situation where the way people staying at home affects the capacity of a healthcare system to cope is a real kind of lesson in that. Um, I think what I'm interested in doing now is that, rather than kind of overloading us with trends that are positive and negative, rather shares some conceptual tools that we've found helpful for making sense. Um, and because, the key to understanding the world that the coronavirus will create is really grasping what it means to live in a complex adaptive system um, that is in a state of equilibrium but can go out of equilibrium and that can evolve. And so what we want to do is we want to share just kind of some of the core things that have really helped us. So the first is that this difference between the crisis. So the crisis could be climate emergency or economic inequality, or in this case, a health crisis, and the meta crisis. And the meta crisis being the ways in which we perceive the crisis, we grasp it, we understand it, and we deliberate and act on how to solve it. And I think that what this moment is revealing is that there are so many interconnected system failures that actually it is a reflection of a deeper failure in how we perceive and how we act. So, a classic example is perceiving the crisis through your ideological or developmental lens. So, for example, I'm going to take a guess and say that most people are probably on the spiritual end of the spectrum, are probably more left-leaning. And so it's very easy to look at things like obvious systems failure, neoliberalism being thrown out and socialism being embraced, hearing of UBI, and thinking that is basically like finally our worldview is going to be able to kind of make its way into the mainstream. But rather there's a kind of a shift in perspective taking where we can hold that and what it means for our worldview to be advanced, and also empathize with someone in the Rust Belt in the United States, and also comprehend the fact that sales of guns are at their highest level in America for the last, I think, 15 years, and that there are many other ways of perceiving what this crisis means and how to act, even looking at the crisis through the lens of ideological polarization means that you're constantly primed to look at the ways in which the governing party of the day, whether they be conservative or Labour or Republican or Democrat, are failing or succeeding, rather than taking a perspective shift and looking at the ways in which kind of all different countries are. So I'm wondering, Rich, if you have anything to share on this kind of shift in perspective from seeing from outside of your own worldview and understanding the meta crisis.
Well, I said I've been disoriented by not knowing who to listen to, and the exception to that rule is I've been listening a lot to different complexity scientists, and it's the complexity scientists that are giving me some frameworks or some containers to put the thoughts in. So like when you're describing the shift out of an ideological, maybe like a tribal perspective on like, yes, I like this government and the government has done a good job or a bad job, and there's this binary view. More complex view is like understanding that we don't get a good society when everyone thinks the way that I think. We get a good society when there's a flourishing of very diverse ways of thinking, and we find what are the minimum set of consensus that's like a good enough that keeps everyone more or less safe and can have the maximum flourishing of people's freedoms and liberties in that process. And that's a real adjustment and posture to be able to get to that point. some of the, I think it's useful. It's a bit dry and, it's like a Monday evening, but still I think it might be useful to think a little in terms of the really abstract stuff of complexity sciences. So like one that's been really present for me for a long, long time, and now I feel like finally I've got a chance to talk about it, is the difference between a normal distribution and a long tail distribution. So a normal distribution is like the height of a human adult. And it's like, it's got this bell shape. It's like most adults are this tall and some of them are this tall and some of them are this tall. And so that means it doesn't matter where you look, you're never going to find an adult human that's 5 meters tall. It's just not, the normal distribution hits zero. There's zero probability of finding that. And that, it's called normal because it's so common, and we apply that filter to lots of different events, and it's not the only way that probabilities are distributed. So the long tail or the power law distribution, instead of coming down to zero, it just goes on and on and on for a long time. And so pandemics are an example of a long tail distribution. So this distribution means when you get out here, the event is not very likely, but it's extremely significant. And so the pandemic that we're currently experiencing is kind of like in this middle area. It's obviously a big deal. It's obviously enough to completely disrupt our world and cause a huge amount of suffering. But as far as pandemics go, we can easily expect one of much greater intensity because there's a low probability of an extremely high impact. That's what the long tail means. It's a much bigger than zero. There's a significant risk of really bad things happening, essentially. And my sense of like, how do you, when I say that, a good society is one where we have this minimum set of consensus that people can agree on. I think protecting ourselves against those kinds of reasonably unlikely but extremely damaging risks is one of the things that a government should be doing. It's one of the things that we should equip ourselves is to understand what are the kind of things that could happen in once in 100 years that would be enough to destroy our way of life or to cause millions of deaths, or like orienting towards those existential risks. To me, you'd expect that would be sort of like the first order of duty.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things it points to is that our system is designed for efficiency over resilience, and so it kind of is pointed at one very narrow metric of I suppose productivity or success, which is GDP. And in one sense GDP is quite good because it creates resources to meet lots of other needs, even though there's massive trade-offs. But the efficiency that every company tries to create and every government tries to create means that there is both a kind of a myopia in how and in the problems it chooses to solve, which is obviously reinforced by the political cycle of 5 years. But it also doesn't have much slack in the system. So, for example, if you compare how Belgium and how Holland have done in their tackling of the crisis. The Netherlands really had a lot of spare capacity of beds in ICUs and ventilators, and they actually had to request from one country to the other because they just had designed their health system in a way that was just maximizing efficiency, which makes a lot of sense. So yeah, trying to think about, on one sense, it's a wake-up call to the need for an awareness of these extreme events and the importance of resiliency, but also keeping in mind that the system is structured in a particular way that is designed to maximize efficiency, and there's a question whether there's the political will to change that. I'd like to talk about two very important aspects of thinking about the crisis in a systemic way. One is cascade effects, and so it's this idea that many of us are becoming increasingly familiar with, that it is not just a health crisis, it's a health crisis that forces people to go into lockdown, which grinds the economy to a halt, which requires a country to print billions in quantitative easing, which impacts their capacity for international aid, which then, when the coronavirus hits developing countries who have poor infrastructure, have even less resource to deal with it. And so it's interesting as a thought experiment to ask, what are the first order effects of the crisis, what are the second order effects, and what are the third order effects. So an example would be that, you know, going into lockdown together has potentially a second order effect on people's mental health. You could also have someone who you're living with who has an extreme, you know, response to the virus, and they end up developing a chronic health condition afterwards, some respiratory lung failure, and all of a sudden you are a household that is struggling with potentially the seeds of depression, which can reoccur many times in a lifetime, and a chronic health condition at a time when, you know, the country is entering into a recession. So all of a sudden, from a place of, you know, relative safety, there is a lot of exposure and a lot of vulnerability. And I think that what countries were slow to realize is the way this actually impacts down the line. I think the head of the Wellcome Trust, which is the largest funder of I think medical philanthropy in the world, apart from the Gates Foundation, its head, who's also on the scientific committee, in response to the virus, said, you know, it's confusing to think about health also in terms of politics and economics. These are strange bedfellows. And this is someone, you know, in a very, very senior position who doesn't have a grasp of systems and complexity and how they work. But that's one, when we go into the breakout rooms, that's important to think about, is what are the cascade effects? You know, one of the most obvious cascade effects is that we've basically flattened the productivity of economies. I think the Bank of England said yesterday that there's a £500 drop in disposable income already in every household in the UK. And we're probably headed into a very deep global recession, but we don't have the policy levers to get us out of it, because we've spent our available public finances already on trying to stimulate the economy through, and also by lowering interest rates. And so we're entering into a recession at a time where these two key policy levers aren't available to us. So yeah, just trying to, and of course the knock-on effect of that is that, you know, we've made a lot of ground on generating some kind of consensus that we need to tackle the climate emergency, but now the question is, where is the investment for it? If a lot of public finances have been spent on reviving the economy, how far down the line is that can kicked, and how exposed will that make us to bigger crises? So that's a really important one to think about. And then the other one that's really important is this idea of confounding effects. So it's not just that the pandemic takes place and the rest of the world freezes or stops. The world goes on. So the question is, what happens if there's a Hurricane Katrina during the pandemic in America? What happens if there's another Australian wildfire? What happens if there's an Amazonian fire? And it's this classic example of, when you're vulnerable, then you're more vulnerable to things going wrong. And within one of the, I think, most startling examples that I heard was the idea was that Asia and Africa are experiencing one of its worst ever locust plagues that's sweeping across Central Africa at the moment. And so there's this question of, they're forced into lockdown, they can't get their harvest on time, their crop is gone. How do they, as a country, survive when there's less international aid? And then how does that affect supply chains? So you start to see the intricate web of interdependency and vulnerability in the system, and how exposed we are. If you take a country like India, with huge population density, it has huge, 33% of the population have proclivities towards diabetes. There's hugely high rates of hypertension in the society. So they are already vulnerable to actually quite a hard response to the virus. And then you just take into account that last summer they had 50-degree heat and heat waves. And so how exposed is India as a country? So I just wonder, Rich, just in relation to confounding effects and cascade effects, is there anything that you feel is important to add?
I think it's important to you've just rolled out a litany of things, most of which are quite pessimistic and negative. And I also want to shine a light on the new possibilities that are opening up. Like 6 months ago, every conversation I had was about how things need to change. We drastically need to change, whether that's the way that workplaces function or schools, or that we need to renew how our governance works, and we need to change the economy, and we need to change culture and behaviors, and all of these demands, which were frequently mired in a sense of stuckness. We've just all globally, we are in the middle of experiencing the possibility that dramatic change is available to us at the drop of a hat, and not just that it's available, but that it happens. That it's not even really up to us. So I think there's a lot of reasons to be. I mean, optimistic is a strong word, but there's a lot of change coming our way, and I want to pay a little attention to some of the possibilities. So, like, one of the obvious ones for me is the way that work changes. So we had this instantaneous transformation of workplaces to being digital first, being remote first, being accessible to people without having to go into the same shared space. And we're still in this phase, which just means you're doing a lot of Zoom calls. But the people that are still working at the moment, they're just having an overload of these meetings and kind of feeling the awkwardness of how doing a meeting online is like a meeting in the office, but only a bit worse. Like, it's not. We're in the awkward phase of learning what it's like to have a digital first workplace. But I really anticipate that is gonna that we're gonna see a flourishing of a different approach to work in general. We're still in the, when radio was first invented, the first programs that they put on the radio were just things that they're taken off the stage, theater productions, and then reproduced on the radio. And it took some time to get the hang of, like, this is a different medium and it has different capabilities and we can do different things about it. So, like, in the context of the workplaces, because this is the expertise that I have, is supporting more collaborative organizations to be more functional. There's a phase that comes after the let's do all of our lifetime on Zoom meetings and have this exhausting video conferencing situation to, okay, how do we work in a more decoupled, more autonomous, more freeing, more asynchronous way? And that, to me, looks like a significant increase in the freedom of workers. And that's pushed by the technology change of us having to maintain distance and making it more difficult for us to be in the same place. But it enables a different relationship between worker and boss. And that's exciting to me. It's the same with the schools. The number of people who are suddenly experimenting with a different approach to education, whether that's homeschooling or deschooling, unschooling, like saying, look, this whole thing of like trying to drive our kids through a factory of knowledge it's not working. We're going to try something different. That, to me, is a real source of nutrients and material for us to try. Yeah, I think there's a lot of momentum to try new things. And we've suddenly got this experience of, when it feels important enough, people are willing to change their behaviors in a drastic way. And it hasn't required a lot of, intense authoritarian interventions from governments. It's been an appeal to people's better natures and a declaration of the facts and say, hey, we need to change. And having that as a possibility in the shared space of whether we are working in government or working in activism or trying to create change in a system, to me, that is such an opportunity to say, look, we managed to stop this huge percentage of flights overnight because we were frightened about getting sick. Surely we can use that experience as material for designing new social movements.
Yeah, I think it's really good to bring that in. And I suppose it's like, how do we hold that opportunity for renewal and almost this kind of validation of this will that you can feel in the collective for something different in education or in health, with the reality that there are lots of bad actors out there, that there are lots of malign forces in the world who are constantly trying to stake out their advantage and see this as an opportunity to do so. So one of the other kind of concepts that I wanted to introduce was this idea of predatory opportunism. So this idea that you seize a moment to advance your agenda. So for example, China could seize America's failure to confront the crisis and its hit to the economy as a way to come into the ascendancy as a global power. Or there could be, an attack on a power grid to shut off electricity. So these are kind of other vulnerabilities that happen. And while there are lots of, I suppose, well-intentioned people who have had ideas that have been at the fringes for so long, there's also a lot of sociopaths and psychopaths that have a huge degree of power and influence. I listened to an amazing podcast with Daniel Schmachtenberger on the Rebel Wisdom podcast on Sunday, and he was talking about conspiracy theories and trying to discern between the kind of the David Icke conspiracy theories with what he would call intelligent nuanced conspiracy theories, and looking at, that since the information about the coronavirus in Wuhan was out, that information would have been accessible to hedge funds via private intelligence firms, or even to people who had clearance to military intelligence. And already you would have had people shorting the market, moving their money around. And that's also a very powerful force in the world. So it's not to dismiss it, it's just to kind of add that shade and that shadow in as well. I'm mindful of the time, and I think that that's enough coherent and incoherent rambling. So I want to summarize that we shared a couple of different conceptual tools. So there was the idea of power laws and how extreme events aren't very probable, but we should try and design our societies for them. We had cascade effects and how systems can spill over and create more vulnerability in other systems. There was the idea of confounding effects, things that could happen while this crisis happens that makes us more vulnerable. There's predatory opportunism, and there's also this experience of the new and of the different, and how that can sow the seeds for entirely new cultures and new systems and new possibilities. And just generally almost the biggest enemy of change is inertia, and all of a sudden that inertia has been broken up. And so we want to turn it over to you now, and we're going to basically go into breakout rooms in groups of 4. And it's a space for you to share, like, what's your reaction to what you've heard? So and like maybe finding the emotional reaction to it. Do you agree with it? Do you feel there was huge things that were missing? What did you disagree? What did you agree with? And also extend it. So what the people in your group, how can you show them other ways of looking at the crisis, other things to consider? So thinking about reaction and extension. Does that make sense for everyone? Does anyone have any questions about this format or how it will work? How long is the breakout groups? Excellent question. Rich, how long is the breakout group?
20 minutes, and I'll give you a little note to say your time is running out. And you have permission as well to stand up and stretch if you're feeling the drained energy of having sat in front of your computer for 40 minutes. Okay, I'm gonna press the magic button that sends people on their way. If I do it right, let's see. Open all rooms.
Great. Oh, everyone's back. Hurrah!
Oh, my separation anxiety is eased.
Great. So, hope you had a good chat. So what we want to do is we want to try and find a way of surfacing all the mini conversations. And so we're going to do this collective exercise. I'm going to send you a link to a web page. It's called Fun Retro, and it basically allows you to write what you think the most important thing is we discuss next, given what you've spoken about in your small groups and what you've heard before. And then there's going to be an opportunity to see what everyone has shared and vote. And the ones with the most votes we deem probably are important to talk about. and then we'll give the remainder of our time to those. So if you look in your chat, I am going to post it now. Is that right? Yes, it is. Yeah. So try and write in whatever you think is most important as clearly and succinctly as possible. Like, don't write in a paragraph, just like in one sentence. And it'll be blurry, but then I'll show all of the entries and then we can vote.
So just to be clear, you're going to have to copy and paste that link because Zoom has disabled the clicking function.
Oh, I've lost it.
Stop sharing. And then there's a little plus. I don't think it's extremely obvious, but you're supposed to press the plus and put your topic in there.
Oh yeah. Do you want to just share the screen in case people are struggling?
I can do that.
Can you
All
put
right.
it back?
So, what?
Can you put it back again? The link.
It's in the chat. It's
I got it.
the last.
I've got it.
So here's the.
You can phrase it as a question, Luke, or you can do it as a sentence. Just whatever is easiest to absorb. And really, like, this is an opportunity if you feel like, these guys have completely got the wrong end of the stick of what the light and the dark of the coronavirus means. Now is your chance to, like, really emphasize what you think is really important to discuss.
I'm just sharing it. Okay.
So if you can mute everyone.
Yeah, I'm on it. This is us experimenting with. You're sharing your screen, Rob, which is not what you were trying to do. I'm going to stop that.
Oh, we're not sharing a screen. Sorry, I thought I was just going to be able to drop it down.
No.
No. So you just click on the link and then you see lots of people are entering it here. So if everyone can enter it in the next like 30 seconds, and then we're going to take a step back and view.
Enter it where?
Whoever is typing something at the top somehow, I don't even know what's going on there, but every time that happens, I'm unable to type in my box.
Yeah, same. I think somebody's maybe editing the title of the whole web trail or something, maybe.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, I've copied. Where do I paste?
Where do you link this? Where do you
Okay.
Where do I get the link?
So I'm going to one more time. There is a green rectangular box and it says add in very small writing, and there's a blinking cursor, and you write in a sentence and then you click add. And then once you've seen, I think now is the time just to have a look through all of the entries, and you basically get to put a thumbs up, and you get 3 thumbs up opportunities. So you can vote for the ones that you think are most important to discuss. So
this fucking box?
I found it.
And if it doesn't make sense, it's our useless experimentation, not any fault of your end.
I've no idea where you paste this bloody link. It's really good.
don't worry about it. It's fine. There's enough of your peers adding stuff that your contribution is bound to have made it in at some point.
Thank you.
Rectangular box, there's share screen on it. There's no other green rectangular box.
Are you going to join them together? Because there's quite a bit of repetition.
Yeah, we might join them together. I'm going to have a look at them now. So if you just want to do your voting, and if you haven't got a chance to enter in, don't worry about it. So, all right. So basically, the acceptance of death as collective and individual is racing ahead with 5 votes. Radical collectivism, mutualism, which is one of Rich's pet topics, has got 2 votes. What are our new ethics has 2. Awakening global empathy has 2. Reducing fear, and fear is in capital letters, which makes it even more scary, has 4 votes. How to make this a global vipassana where possible, bottom-up change. 6 votes for what is an inspiring but believable vision for a new normal.
Oh,
really good. How can democracy evolve? And then on 5 votes, how do we harness the power of all the personal transformation and opening to a larger potential for change? Okay, so.
Can we sort by top votes? Yes, here we go. Ba-dow.
Can you do that, Rich?
I just did it with my powers. This is us trying to learn how to do a more interactive kind of talk. And please excuse the extreme awkwardness at some points in some junctures.
All right. So, Rich, do you want to read out the top 3 things that we'll discuss?
Top 3: an inspiring but believable vision for a new normal. That's the top of the pile. And then, how do we harness the power of all the personal transformations and opening into a larger potential for change? And then finally, a topic about death. The acceptance of death as collective and individual. Do you feel called to one of those, Ronan?
Just a second. Can you read them out again? I just want to write them down.
An inspiring but believable vision for a new normal.
Okay. Yeah. And then how do we harness personal transformation for collective?
Yeah. I mean, that's got you written all over it, hasn't it?
I feel called at least to begin to talk about death. Right. So when I was 4, my brother was killed in a car accident outside of our house, and that was a really terrible thing to happen. And for whatever reason, it was a very early confrontation with death. And every night, I was raised in rural Ireland and went to Mass every Sunday. I used to pray to God and pray that my dad wouldn't die of cancer, because he smokes 20 Silica Purple a day and still does. And I was in India at the time of when the coronavirus first kind of was bubbling up in Wuhan, and decided to leave early. And I actually came home to my family in rural Ireland and lived with them for a month. And it was this incredibly intense and very raw process of spending a huge quality time with my father, while knowing that he has COPD, which is a chronic lung disease that puts him at one of the highest risk categories, along with being 70 and smoking. And it was a very strange experience. On one of the last days I was there before deciding to move back to the UK before lockdown, to help build my sister's house with him. And, often we have these intense moments of quality time when a parent is at their deathbed, but this was one when he was fully alive and very well. And yet there was this awareness that the next time I come home could be for his funeral. And I think all of us have a experience of that, or have the potential to have an experience of that. The cultural writer Dougal Tyne, he's one of the founders of the Dark Mountain Project. He wrote a very interesting article that spoke about how this is a moment, a collective moment, where we're being confronted with parental mortality, which I think is very, very interesting. And I think that when I think about acceptance of death, it's not just accepting that our loved ones die and that death is a part of life. I wonder whether it's the death of an adolescent self that on some level is always reinforced as long as parents are alive. And that there's something in the death process of our elders or of our parents that, if properly supported, allows us to, on some level, step a little bit forward on our journey of growth. So that's just an initial thought I have on death, but it's very obvious that it's a real thing, when everything in society keeps us from it.
It kind of makes me think about that other question as well, of how do we define a believable vision of a new normal. In a weird way, we had young people drawing our attention to death before this came along, with Greta Thunberg and the Fridays for Future movement, and seeing all of these young people come up and say, we've got no future, that our future is dead already. And and then really hitting a generational wall there, where they're saying the people older than us they're not doing their duty of care. You know, they're not looking after us. They should be opening up, nurturing a world for us to step into, and they're doing the exact opposite. And one cause for optimism for me is the possibility of a real intergenerational movement that comes out of this, where the story of, you know, if we do this well, that the entire society mobilized to protect the older generation. I can imagine the kind of cross-generational solidarity that comes out of it, so that the next challenge that we confront is about how do we mobilize the elder people that have so much power and wealth and so much resistance to change frequently, to look after the coming generations and to loosen up and allow for some change to happen. And this question of a new normal, for me, like, my honest position on it is, like, I think we'll get there. The vision for a new normal, I think, is going to come after we let go, after the release, after the dissolution and the crumbling of the certainties and the old, our commitments to who we think are our ideological tribes, or the movements that we thought were the most important movements. I have this real intuitive sense that if we can allow those things to dissolve, if we can allow ourselves to be pulverized by this experience, and really step into the uncertainty and the not knowingness and the disorientation, I have this kind of root optimism that we can summon something from that space of not knowing, from that bottom point, that will, something new, something that we haven't imagined, something that is not some old-fashioned replayed story of something we've heard before, and it's not just the usual suspects, but is really like a completely new character that emerges from a new future that we're entering into. And my big question, I guess, is, like, do we have the willingness and the capacity to allow ourselves to surrender and to collapse before we do the next step, which is about action and confidence and direction and drive and motivation?
I'd like to add a bit more to this idea of what is a believable new normal. So I see the coronavirus, the pandemic, as a series of blows that this system that has, you know, I think someone originated it in like 1649 or whenever the accountancy was created for corporations to do their thing back in colonial times. But it's a series of hits to the system that I think began with the 2008 financial crisis that simultaneously weaken it. I know Jamie Wheel used the example of an elderly person who, you know, they might be in their 70s and they're pretty healthy, and all of a sudden they slip and they break their hip, and their hip recovers, but they're not what they were, and they've kind of taken this step down in capacity and an increase in vulnerability, and then something else happens. They might get a lung infection, but they never quite fully recover, and it's this slow descent. Like, the collapse of the Roman Empire wasn't an overnight phenomenon. It was a series of hits that created greater levels of vulnerability and an exposure. And so I feel like that the pandemic, at the very least, has opened up an awareness that this system is designed for efficiency and not resilience. And I think that there will probably be a political consensus on both sides that we need to be prepared for black swan events, and that you know, arguments about needing to change to avoid climate catastrophe will feel more real for people because they kind of have done a dress rehearsal of vulnerability. However, a lot of the power structures that dictate our system are still very much present. If anything, they've solidified power. You'll probably see the bottoming out of a lot of small to medium-sized enterprises, while all the big platforms like Amazon have actually centralized their power at a time when most small to medium-sized enterprises in the US are hemorrhaging employees. Amazon put out a call out for 100,000 new jobs. So it's important to think about this in terms of how does this distribute power? How does it in any fundamental way challenge vested interests? I do think it's quite interesting that with an elderly population dying off, will there be a swing towards just less conservatism, more openness? So there's a question to me when I ask myself about what's feasible of a new normal. I think an awareness that we need to make our system more resilient, but I still think the same bad actors, as I would call them, are still there. However, I think there's something that probably many people here can relate to, which is when we have awakening moments on retreats. We take a step outside of reality, we go through a very profound personal transformational experience, we kind of come into contact more and more with our essence. And I feel like there's a collective version of that happening, in the sense that we're being reminded of our vulnerability. People around us might die. We're being taken out of contexts that are distracting and stimulating and pressurized. And you can see this kind of subtle thread of, what really matters. BBC Radio 4, the journalists are reading poems every day that sustain and nourish them. There's this kind of deeper sensibility that I think is emerging that you have in a retreat. And so I think we're getting into contact with more the essence of humanity. And like we know in our personal lives, we then lose ourselves again and again in default world. We get lost in the conditioned behaviors that we have, our patterns. We get lost in the obligations that we have. But somehow, if a retreat is very powerful, it's sown a seed inside you that brings you back to that essence and allows you at least some kind of compass to navigate. And I think that's what's happening at a collective level. If you think about what sustains neoliberalism as a political economy, it's a lot of embodied experiences of the power of individualism and consumerism and the seduction of that. And now what I feel is that we've gotten an exposure to the value set that underlies something that might be more socialist in its aspirations, or more caring, or more compassionate. We've done a kind of a dress rehearsal. So I think there's some really good ethical foundations being built that kind of new political movements and political parties can appeal to, whereas before it just kind of wasn't there. However, I still think it's operating in a system where a lot of the power structures are the same.
Well, this is the really puzzling thing for me, and the reason that I'm saying I feel called to surrender and to sit in that not knowing is that my pre-existing frames of reference don't seem to be super applicable anymore. So like my sort of political tradition is coming from basically anarchism and direct democracy and prioritizing people's freedom and their autonomy and decentralization of power. And that's been my whole orientation. It's like, how do we spread things out? But an honest appraisal of what's happened in different countries, it's like, it's so obvious to me now that there is a kind of centralization that is really necessary. Like if you look at what's happened in New Zealand, in New Zealand, you've got the Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, she's simply playing the mother of the nation. Like she's really playing that card really hard, and it's working. Like the number of people that I've talked to back home, they have said they feel genuine love and admiration for the Prime Minister, and they feel like she's a part of the family and that she is caring for us like a good mother would care for us. Like that's a really common experience at the moment in New Zealand, that people are having this sense of like, we are one big family, and they're absolutely hanging off every word that she says. And she's portraying this kind of authority, which is super compassionate, super clear, just, that she's not infantilizing. She says, I know we're asking a hard thing of you. We know it's not going to be fun and you're not going to enjoy it, but we really need you to do this. And people are taking it seriously. And then seeing what's happening in other countries, like the States is probably a really good example of how you don't have that centralization. You have all the states doing different things, plus you have the political polarization. And without that central figure of coherence, you've just got a completely incoherent response to a pandemic. And an incoherent response to a pandemic is definitely going to be ineffective, And so I'm reckoning with this thing of like, I thought centralization and authoritarianism was and nationalism, especially nationalism, I thought was kind of the root of all kinds of evil. And I think it still is, but I'm forced to admit there's a kind of exercise of nationalism, which is actually at the moment seems to be doing a good thing. And so I'm trying to relax on my foregone conclusions and let's see if I hope I don't have to eat my words as New Zealand degenerates into some kind of red state.
So that is what we have time for tonight. This is, so I want to thank Rich for coming along and for everyone for taking part. This is basically a series that we're running, trying to make sense of the coronavirus and its impact. Next week, next Monday, I'll be in a conversation with Gail Bradbrook, one of the founders of Extinction Rebellion, and the question is whether the coronavirus is leading to a shift in consciousness. So it's maybe more of an attempt to go from the kind of big picture systems thinking into the psyche and the soul of society and ask what changes we might see. So if anyone is interested in coming to that, you can find it on the Psychedelic Society website. We're going to get real mystical. And I want to leave us with, I read something which was really helpful a couple of days ago, which was that, there's a lot of false positivism and this kind of everything's going to be great. And then there are more despairing people. But someone had this idea of optimistic equanimity. So equanimity obviously being that we're okay with whatever happens and we can hold the contrast, the light and the dark. But there's a general sense of using whatever happens for the best possible outcome and in service. So on a personal level, if that means, you're going through a really difficult time, how you can use that as fuel for your growth. And I really like that as a framing. Optimistic equanimity doesn't really roll off the tongue, but maybe we can find a shorter expression of that. Have you any last closing thoughts, Rich?
Just a bashful sense of gratitude for everyone experimenting along with us, trying to work out how we can do a kind of talk on the computer when we're all at home and interact with each other and try and simulate the experience of being connected and enjoying that face-to-faceness. Thanks for dealing with the clumsiness of our gestures and going along with it. And please, do show up again next time. Ronan, should we have all of the microphones off and we can bid each other a good night all simultaneously?
Yeah.
I'm going to unmute everyone.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Good night.
Good night, everybody.
Bye.
Sweet dreams.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Ciao. Ciao.
Woo! Bye.
Bye now. Bye.
A lot of fun. Ronan and Rich, thanks,
Let's just making noises.
Noises.
Yes. Oh, please help yourself to a cup of tea and Vicky's in the other room. Can you give me a hand to clean up too? Thank you.
Bye to the people in my breakout group as well. Very nice meeting you.
Yeah. It was fabulous. So much.
Rich, should we have an after party for the people who don't leave the Zoom call in time?
Yeah, absolutely.
I have Yenifi.
Just get really fucking pissed.
Great.
If you want some feedback, that was
hi,
just...
Wolfie.
Hey, you two are in the same room.
I'm like that guy you had to kick out of your house party.
Did you know you can stream music on Zoom?
I love that. Love it.
That really worked.
Right.
Yeah.
Bye, guys. Lots of love.
Well done, guys. That was cool.
Thanks for playing along.
Thank you, guys. Wow.